"Get those children off association property right now," she screamed, and the little boy beside me dropped his marshmallow straight into the fire. I was kneeling near the edge of Juniper Lake, helping 9-year-old Eli Turner make his first proper s'more, when Marlene Whitcomb marched through the smoke in a cream-colored suit and heels that had no business anywhere near a cattle trail. Behind her came 3 members of the Ashford Ridge HOA board, all holding phones like they were documenting a hostage situation, instead of 20 kids sitting around a campfire. Marlene pointed at me, then at the children, and announced that she was calling 911 to report trespassing on community land. The strange part was, she was standing nearly 60 yards inside my private ranch, on property my family had owned since 1949, and that phone call was about to become the most expensive mistake she had ever made. 6 months earlier, I had inherited Red Hollow Ranch from my grandfather, Boone Mercer, 43 acres of cedar hills, limestone trails, and a spring-fed lake so clear you could watch a largemouth bass turn beneath the dock. Boone had lived there almost his entire life, and he believed children needed dirt under their fingernails the same way they needed food and sleep. Every Saturday since the late 80s, he had opened the lake to local families, free of charge, no memberships, no matching shirts, no glossy brochures, just fishing poles, campfires, and adults willing to teach kids how to enjoy 5 quiet minutes without staring at a screen. He called it Creek Light Saturdays. Before he passed, he squeezed my wrist from that narrow hospital bed and said, "Wade, keep the lake open. People with too much money and too little joy will always try to put a fence around something beautiful." I thought he was being poetic. Turns out he was giving me a warning. My first Saturday running the camp, 27 kids showed up before 8 in the morning. The air smelled like wet grass, coffee, and sunscreen. Minivan doors slammed along the gravel drive, and parents handed me backpacks while wearing the relieved expressions of people escaping a birthday party they had accidentally volunteered to host. By noon, kids were catching bluegill off the dock, skipping stones, and arguing about whether a turtle could recognize its own name. I stood there listening to their laughter roll across the water, and finally understood why Boone had protected the place so fiercely. Then Marlene Whitcomb arrived in a black luxury SUV, polished so perfectly it looked offended by the dust. Marlene was president of the Ashford Ridge Homeowners Association, a subdivision of 280 homes built along the eastern boundary of the ranch. She had the posture of someone expecting every room to become a meeting the moment she entered it. She introduced herself with a tight smile and said, "Mr. Mercer, I assume you are unaware of the disruption your activities are causing our residents." I looked toward the lake where 2 little girls were trying to bait a hook with half a hot dog. What disruption would that be? Traffic, noise, smoke, liability exposure, and the general appearance of an unregulated recreational operation. She said unregulated the way most people say contaminated. I told her the camp was private, free, supervised, and located entirely on my land. Then I went to the truck, pulled out the recorded deed and survey map Boone had always kept in a weatherproof folder, and showed her the boundary line. Marlene stared at the documents longer than necessary, as though she might intimidate the ink into moving. Finally, she handed them back and said, "Boundaries can be interpreted." "No," I said, "they can be measured." Her smile disappeared. That was the exact moment this stopped being about noise. Marlene had spent 7 years turning Ashford Ridge into her personal kingdom. She found families for basketball hoops left near the curb, patio furniture in unapproved colors, and holiday lights that stayed up after the first weekend in January. One widow received weekly violations because her grandson parked an old pickup in the driveway while helping repair her roof. People did not like Marlene, but they were afraid of becoming her next project. Creek Light Saturdays bothered her because it existed outside her authority. Children laughed without permission. Families gathered without paying dues, and I had answered her with a deed instead of an apology. 2 weeks later, the inspections began. County Health sent a man named Russell with a clipboard to investigate an unlicensed childcare facility. He found first aid kits, emergency contact sheets, marked swimming zones, life jackets in every size, and 4 adult volunteers trained in CPR. He stayed for lunch and left with a plate of barbecue. The fire marshal arrived after a complaint about illegal burning. He examined the stone fire ring, checked the water barrels, and told me Boone had built a safer setup than half the county campgrounds. Animal Control received a report that children were harassing protected wildlife. The officer watched Eli release his sunfish and muttered, "I think the fish will recover emotionally." Every complaint failed, but failure only made Marlene more determined. She created an online group called Ashford Ridge Community Protection and began posting photographs of our camp. A kid floating in an inner tube became an unsupervised minor operating water equipment. Smoke from roasted marshmallows became hazardous airborne pollution. Parents started receiving anonymous messages warning that their insurance could be canceled if their children were injured on controversial property. Attendance dropped from 27 kids to 18, then 11. The parents who kept coming began lowering their voices when they arrived, glancing toward the subdivision like they expected someone to photograph their license plates. That was the part that got under my skin. Not the inspections, not the letters, not even Marlene walking the fence line every morning with 2 board members and a camera. It was watching good parents feel guilty for giving their children a day outside. One Saturday, a mother named Denise apologized while dropping off her son. She said Marlene had approached her after church and warned that families supporting my camp might face closer HOA compliance reviews. Denise tried to laugh, but her hands were shaking. That evening, after the last child went home, I sat alone on the dock with Boone's old tackle box beside me. The lake was flat, the campfire had burned down to red coals, and for the first time I wondered whether keeping my promise was going to cost more than I could afford. Then I remembered something Boone used to say whenever a machine refused to start. Before you hit it harder, find out what it is hiding. I went into his workshop, a leaning cedar building behind the equipment barn, and started searching through 40 years of tools, recips, rusted coffee cans, and parts from tractors that no longer existed. Behind his welding bench, half covered by an old canvas tarp, I found a narrow steel cabinet bolted to the wall. The key was taped beneath the bottom drawer exactly where Boone used to hide spare truck keys. Inside were surveys I had never seen, letters from energy companies, maps showing lines that ran far beyond the ranch boundary, and a sealed agreement dated October 1986. I read the first page once, then again more slowly. Boone had not simply owned Red Hollow Ranch. He had retained mineral rights and permanent surface access beneath most of Ashford Ridge, including its clubhouse, its private park, and nearly 50 residential lots. Then I reached the penalty clause, saw the number printed there, and understood why my grandfather had never seemed worried about the HOA. Marlene thought she was chasing children away from a fishing hole, but every threat, every patrol, and every false claim of ownership was pushing her toward a legal trap worth more than $2 million. I took the agreement to a lawyer named Rachel Kimball, a quiet woman with silver-framed glasses and the kind of calm voice that made bad news sound like a weather report. She specialized in land and energy law, which meant she spent most of her days reading documents normal people avoided until those documents were about to ruin their lives. We met in a second-floor office above a bank in Mason Creek, and I spread Boone's maps across her conference table while she worked through the contract line by line. After 20 minutes, she leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "Wade, your grandfather was either extremely cautious or deeply suspicious of homeowners associations." "Probably both," I said. Rachel pointed to a paragraph buried near the end of the agreement. The mineral lease granted permanent access across the surface for inspection, maintenance, drilling, and transport, and any organized attempt to interfere with those rights triggered damages beginning at $2.1 million, adjusted through a separate renewal formula. Ashford Ridge had been built over land burdened by that agreement, and the developer had acknowledged the easement years before, selling the first home. Every resident should have received notice at closing. But from the documents Rachel pulled, it looked like those disclosures had either been minimized or buried beneath language no ordinary buyer would understand. I asked her the obvious question: "Does this mean I can tear up their tennis courts?" She looked over her glasses. "Legally, the energy company may have certain access rights. Practically, if you drive a bulldozer through a pickleball tournament, I will deny ever meeting you." That was the first time I laughed in weeks. Then she explained the important part. Marlene's campaign had not yet triggered the full penalty, because being obnoxious was not the same as obstructing a protected operation. To cross that line, she would need to falsely claim control over the land, interfere with access, or use the HOA as an organized body to prevent me from exercising rights tied to the lease. I thought about her patrols, the warning letters, the online posts, and the attorney threatening to seize control of the lake. She was close. Rachel tapped the map with one finger. She believes you are a mechanic running a backyard camp. Let her keep believing that. From that moment on, I stopped reacting and started documenting. I installed 2 trail cameras near the eastern fence, another above the barn door, and a small recording unit by the dock. I saved every email, every violation notice, every social media post, and every voicemail from frightened parents. I wrote down dates, times, names, exact language, the kind of boring details that do not feel powerful until a lawyer puts them in chronological order. Marlene made the work easy. Her patrol members started stepping through gaps in the fence to photograph the lake from better angles. One of them walked almost a quarter-mile onto the ranch and left a laminated notice tied to Boone's old fishing shed, declaring the area subject to community environmental review. I sent the photograph to Rachel. She replied with 3 words, "Keep letting them." Meanwhile, Marlene intensified the pressure on families. She called Denise's employer and suggested Denise was knowingly exposing her son to unsafe conditions. She sent anonymous letters to 2 parents warning that child welfare authorities might investigate anyone allowing minors to attend unlicensed camps. The letters were nonsense, but nonsense printed on official-looking paper still scares people. One Saturday, only 6 children arrived. Ellie was among them, carrying a dented tackle box that had belonged to his father. He sat beside me on the dock and asked why the other kids had stopped coming. I told him grown-ups sometimes let fear make decisions for them. He stared at the water and said, "My dad says that lady only wins if everybody listens to her." I looked at that boy, 9 years old, bare feet dangling over the lake, and felt ashamed that I had spent even one evening wondering whether to close the camp. Children usually see bullies more clearly than adults do. Adults get distracted by titles, money, uniforms, and letterhead. Kids just notice who is being mean. A few days later, Marlene's attorney sent a formal demand claiming Ashford Ridge possessed historical recreational rights to Juniper Lake through an old community access agreement. There was no such agreement. Rachel searched county records, title histories, and development filings going back 50 years. Nothing supported the claim. In fact, the earliest subdivision map clearly marked a ranch boundary and identified the lake as private water outside HOA jurisdiction. Marlene was not confused anymore. She was inventing ownership. Rachel called me that evening and said she's trying to manufacture a dispute where none exists. That is dangerous for her. I asked whether it was dangerous enough. "Not yet," she said. But she's walking toward the edge without looking down. The next board meeting pushed her closer. Margaret Carlson, a retired school librarian who lived in Ashford Ridge, slipped me an audio recording afterward. Margaret had supported Creeklight Saturdays for years, though she kept quiet because Marlene had once fined her for planting sunflowers taller than the approved landscaping limit. In the recording, Marlene told the board that my lake represented an underutilized community rights and claimed residents had a moral right to control it because the ranch affected their property values. One board member asked whether they actually owned any portion of the shoreline. Marlene answered, "Ownership is a matter of enforcement. Whoever maintains control establishes the practical boundary." That sentence nearly made Rachel choke on her coffee. She played it twice, then smiled for the first time since taking the case. Now we are getting somewhere. The board approved $42,000 for what Marlene called protective legal action, money taken directly from the HOA reserve fund. The official motion authorized attorneys to establish association authority over the lake, restrict public access, and prevent unapproved gatherings. They were using hundreds of homeowners' dues to claim my family property and interfere with activities protected under an older recorded agreement. Rachel prepared a notice informing the HOA that their claim conflicted with mineral and surface access rights, but she did not send it immediately. She wanted one final piece of evidence showing Marlene personally understood the boundary and chose to ignore it. We did not have to wait long. Marlene began telling residents that she planned to inspect the camp herself and shut it down in front of witnesses. Her posts grew more dramatic by the day. She called me a commercial operator exploiting children, claimed the lake posed a threat to the subdivision, and announced that Ashford Ridge would reclaim control before the end of summer. I started to see what drove her. It was not really the camp, the smoke, or even the noise. Marlene had built her identity around being obeyed. Every violation letter, every fine, every frightened neighbor confirmed that she mattered. Then I had shown her a map and told her no. To someone like that, no was not a boundary. It was humiliation. Rachel suggested we schedule a public community meeting at the ranch and invite county officials, homeowners, parents, and the local paper. The stated purpose would be to discuss safety, land use, and the future of Creek Light Saturdays. The real purpose was to create a setting where Marlene would either back down publicly or overreach in front of witnesses. I posted the invitation on a Thursday afternoon. By sunset, Marlene had shared it to the HOA group with a message calling it my final attempt to manipulate the community. She urged residents to attend and promised the board would assert its lawful authority. Rachel called after reading the post. "She's coming," she said. "I know. And she thinks the meeting is on association land." That is what she wrote. Rachel went quiet for a moment, then said, "Make sure every property marker is visible." The day before the meeting, I walked the boundary with a licensed surveyor and replaced every faded stake with bright orange markers. We photographed each one, logged the coordinates, and placed 2 temporary signs near the camp entrance reading "Private Property, Red Hollow Ranch." I hated seeing signs around a place Boone had always kept welcoming. But Rachel reminded me this was not about keeping people out. It was about making sure nobody could later pretend they did not know where they stood. Saturday arrived warm and still, with sunlight turning the lake gold near the shoreline. 20 children came early for what I told them would be the last regular campfire before school started. Parents spread blankets under the cottonwoods while volunteers set out hot dogs, lemonade, and marshmallows. For the first time in months, attendance felt almost normal. Ely was showing his younger sister how to hold a fishing pole when I heard tires grinding over the gravel entrance. A black SUV stopped beside the first orange boundary marker. Marlene stepped out wearing a cream suit, dark sunglasses, and an expression so confident it almost made me doubt the evidence in my own pocket. 3 board members followed her, each carrying a phone and a folder. They walked past the private property sign without slowing down. Rachel stood near the barn with the county survey map rolled beneath one arm. Deputy Aaron Pike, invited to keep the peace, waited beside his patrol vehicle. Several parents had already started recording. Marlene ignored every one of them and marched straight toward the campfire. I was kneeling beside Eli's little sister, helping her turn a marshmallow without burning it, when Marlene's voice tore across the lake. "Get those children off association property right now." The girl flinched. Ellie stepped in front of her, and every conversation around the fire stopped. I stood slowly and looked at the orange markers behind Marlene, then at Rachel, who gave me the smallest nod. Marlene had crossed the boundary, ignored the signs, brought the board onto my ranch, and publicly claimed control of land she had already been shown did not belong to her. All she had to do now was make the mistake Rachel had been waiting for. And when she pulled out her phone and announced she was calling 911 to report me for trespassing, I knew Boone's 40-year-old trap had finally closed. Marlene lifted the phone like she was raising a flag over conquered territory, then spoke loudly enough for every parent and child to hear. "This is Marlene Whitcomb, president of the Ashford Ridge Homeowners Association. I need officers immediately. A man is operating an illegal camp on association land and refusing to remove trespassers." Rachel stood near the barn without saying a word, but I saw her glance toward Deputy Aaron Pike, who was already walking toward us with his body camera recording. I kept my voice calm and told Marlene one final time that she was standing on Red Hollow Ranch and needed to leave. She stepped closer instead, heels sinking into the soft ground, and jabbed a finger toward my chest. "You do not get to hide behind old papers while endangering this community." Behind her, one board member quietly lowered his phone. Suddenly less confident than he had been 5 minutes earlier, Aaron asked Marlene to end the call and showing the survey she claimed proved HOA ownership. She handed him a color printout with a thick blue line drawn around the lake, but the page had no county seal, no recording number, and no surveyor signature. Aaron compared it with the official map Rachel provided, checked the orange markers, then looked directly at Marlene. "Ma'am, you are approximately 60 yards inside Mr. Mercer's property." She blinked as if he had started speaking another language. "That cannot be right," she said. Aaron pointed toward the private property sign she had walked past. "It is right, and you were previously notified of the boundary. You need to leave now." For one brief second, I thought she might finally understand how badly she had miscalculated. But people like Marlene do not retreat when reality embarrasses them. They attack reality. She accused Aaron of favoritism, claimed the county records had been manipulated, and ordered the parents to remove their children before the HOA held them responsible for any injuries. Illy's little sister started crying again, and something in the crowd shifted. These families had spent months being intimidated one at a time, but now they were standing together, watching the same woman frighten their children while the law told her she was wrong. Denise stepped forward and said, "You threatened my job because my son came fishing here." Another father raised his phone and told Marlene every word was being recorded. Margaret Colson appeared beside Rachel and asked the board members whether they truly wanted their names attached to this. One of them, a nervous accountant named Paul, looked at Marlene and said, "You told us the HOA owned the shoreline." "We do," she snapped. Aaron shook his head. "No, you do not." Then he issued her a formal trespass warning in front of everyone. That should have ended it, but Marlene made one last mistake. She announced that the HOA would physically restrict access to the ranch until ownership could be resolved, and she ordered Paul to contact the security contractor about installing barriers at my entrance. Rachel stepped forward for the first time. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitcomb," she said quietly. "That statement completes the record." Marlene turned toward her. "Who are you?" "My attorney," I said. Rachel introduced herself, handed Marlene a legal notice, and explained that Red Hollow Ranch held recorded mineral and surface access rights predating Ashford Ridge rights the HOA had now knowingly attempted to obstruct. She told Marlene the board's authorized spending, false ownership claims, surveillance, and threatened barriers had triggered a contractual interference action, with damages exceeding $2 million. The color drained from Marlene's face so quickly I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She looked toward her board members for support, but Paul was already backing away. Another member asked Rachel whether individual directors could be held personally responsible for actions outside their authority. Rachel said that would depend on what they had approved, what they knew, and how honestly they cooperated from that point forward. I had never seen three people become cooperative so fast. By Monday morning, Paul and another director had delivered copies of board emails, invoices, and private messages to Rachel. What began as a property case turned into something uglier. Marlene had spent more than $60,000 from HOA reserves on investigators, attorneys, mail campaigns, and so-called community safety consulting without proper votes. Several payments went to a consulting company registered to her brother. There were restaurant charges, hotel bills, and personal purchases hidden beneath vague descriptions like neighborhood outreach. The new evidence spread through Ashford Ridge faster than summer fire through dry grass. Residents demanded an emergency meeting, and Marlene arrived expecting to control the room the way she always had. Instead, nearly 200 homeowners were waiting with printed financial statements and years of resentment. Margaret stood at the microphone and read Marlene's own words from the recording. "Ownership is a matter of enforcement." Then she asked the room whether they wanted a president who believed taking something long enough made it hers. The vote to remove Marlene was nearly unanimous. The new board contacted Rachel before the week ended. They could not afford the full interference claim without imposing devastating assessments on families who had never supported Marlene's campaign. I could have demanded every dollar. Legally, I had the leverage, and part of me wanted to use it. I remembered the empty dock, the frightened parents, and Eli asking why adults listened to bullies. Then I remembered Boone's last words: "Keep the lake open for kids." He had not told me to punish 300 families for one woman's hunger for control. We negotiated a settlement funded by the HOA insurer, the remaining reserve account, Marlene's personal restitution, and a contribution from the energy company renewing the old lease. The final amount was just over $2 million, but instead of disappearing into legal fees, most of it established the Boone Mercer Outdoor Trust. Creek Lights Saturdays became permanent, free, and protected by an independent nonprofit board. We built a safer dock, added a covered teaching pavilion, hired 2 certified outdoor instructors, and created scholarships for local students studying conservation and agriculture. Ashford Ridge agreed to remove every false claim against the ranch and adopt new rules limiting board power, requiring open votes for legal spending, and protecting residents from retaliatory enforcement. Marlene eventually pleaded guilty to misusing association funds and was ordered to repay what she had taken. She sold her house the following spring. On moving day, her SUV rolled past the ranch while 80 children were gathered around the lake, their laughter carrying all the way to the road. She did not look toward us. I did not wave. Some endings do not need a final argument. The moment I remember most happened a few weeks later. At sunset, when Eli stood beside the same fire where Marlene had frightened his sister, he held up a marshmallow burned black on one side and asked whether it still counted as golden. I told him it counted as experienced. He laughed, handed it to his sister, and started another one. Around us, parents talked without whispering. Children ran along the shore, and smoke rose through the cottonwoods into a sky turning orange over Juniper Lake. I used to think property rights were mainly about fences, surveys, and keeping people from taking what belonged to you. Boone understood something deeper. Sometimes ownership means protecting a place from people who want control more than they want community. Marlene believed rules gave her power over everyone around her. But rules without humility become weapons, and sooner or later, somebody checks the boundary. So tell me honestly, did I do the right thing by settling and protecting the homeowners? Or should the entire HOA have been forced to pay for allowing Marlene to rule through fear for so many years? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this story with someone who has survived a neighborhood tyrant, and tell me where you think responsibility ends and complicity begins.